What did ancient humans do with the mentally ill? Imagine waking up in the dead of night and you hear voices. They aren't yours. They might be shouting warnings, whispering secrets, or just creating absolute chaos while the rest of your village sleeps. Now, picture this happening to you 3 millennia ago in ancient Egypt. There's no clinical diagnosis. There's no modern medication. You certainly don't have a therapist charging top dollar to ask how your childhood went. Instead, you get a high priest, maybe a sacred animal, and a very intense ritual. And the crazy thing is, depending on the exact era and empire you lived in, this could have been surprisingly helpful, or an absolute nightmare, because how a society treats a mind in distress reveals its true colors. Let's begin with prehistoric humans. Believe it or not, we have hard evidence of how they handled mental illness, and it is pretty extreme. Archaeologists have unearthed ancient skulls featuring perfectly carved, deliberate holes. These weren't battle scars. This was a surgical procedure known as trepanation, and the craziest part is that bone regrowth shows many patients survived it. The prevailing theory? They were drilling an exit door to let the demons out. If someone was acting erratically or hearing voices, the logic was that an evil spirit was trapped inside their head. Drill a hole, release the demon, and problem solved. What's truly mind-blowing is that entirely disconnected civilizations, from ancient Greece to medieval Peru, independently decided that drilling holes in skulls was the answer to psychological distress. Moving on to ancient Mesopotamia, things get fascinating. In Babylon and Assyria, mental illness wasn't viewed as a medical issue. It was a spiritual accounting problem. If you were suffering, it meant you had angered the gods. This was known as the hand of a god doctrine. Your madness was literally the weight of a deity pressing down on you. Honestly, if you've ever experienced a panic attack, that metaphor of a heavy weight pressing down feels surprisingly accurate. The treatment required specialized priests called ashipu. They were basically ancient spiritual detectives whose job was to figure out which god you offended and prescribe a cleansing ritual. And before we judge them, these priests were genuinely trying to help. They meticulously catalogued symptoms that we would now recognize as depression, schizophrenia, and epilepsy on massive clay tablets. They just had the cause totally wrong. What do you think you would have been diagnosed with if you lived in ancient Babylon? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Over in ancient Egypt, the approach was remarkably progressive. Medical texts from around 1550 BC, like the Ebers Papyrus, treated mental disorders as physical conditions, specifically of the heart and uterus. Sure, their anatomy was a bit off, but they treated these issues medically rather than just spiritually. Egyptian physicians prescribed rest, herbal remedies, and soothing environments. They even had an ancient temple dedicated to the healing god Imhotep, where distressed individuals could sleep in peaceful gardens to receive therapeutic dream interpretations. That ancient incubation therapy sounds more relaxing than a lot of modern psychiatric wards. Then we cross over to ancient Greece, where philosophy collided with medicine. The Greeks were torn between two frameworks. The first was the divine explanation. Some believed mental illness was a gift or a punishment from the gods. To figures like Plato, divine madness gave a person access to profound truths that ordinary rational people couldn't see. Oracles and prophets were considered spiritually gifted precisely because their minds worked differently. If you're finding this deep dive into ancient psychology fascinating, hit that like button to let me know. The second Greek framework was purely medical. Hippocrates entirely rejected the idea of demonic possession or divine intervention. He argued that mental disturbances were physical diseases of the brain caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. In fact, depression was literally called black bile disease because they thought you had too much of it. While his science was completely wrong, the idea that mental illness had a biological basis was centuries ahead of its time. The Romans eventually inherited these Greek ideas, for better and for worse. Physicians like Galen recommended warm baths, exercise, dietary shifts, and even conversation to help patients. Talking through problems with a doctor was a distant early shadow of modern psychotherapy. But Rome also gave us a much darker legal concept, the Furiosis. If a wealthy Roman had a relative whose madness was embarrassing or threatened an inheritance, a local magistrate could declare them a madman and lock them up. It was a legal loophole that greedy relatives easily weaponized. Fast forward to the Middle Ages. There's a massive misconception that this era was purely superstitious and horrific for the mentally ill. While Europe was certainly performing exorcisms, the medieval Islamic world was achieving incredible medical breakthroughs. The 11th century physician Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, wrote comprehensive medical texts describing anxiety, depression, and OCD. He recommended music therapy, exercise, and psychic treatment, essentially using conversation to alter a patient's mental state. In the 8th and 9th centuries, cities like Baghdad and Cairo built the very first psychiatric hospitals. These weren't prisons. They were places of healing with running water, gardens, and physician oversight. Do you think we've completely moved past these ancient misunderstandings, or do we still carry some of that stigma today? Let me know your perspective in the comments. Meanwhile, back in medieval Europe, things were a mixed bag. Yes, the demonic possession theory was loud, but on a local level, many communities simply integrated disturbed individuals into daily life. They were fed, included, and looked after. The town of Geel in Belgium is the ultimate example. Since the 13th century, they have operated a community foster care system for mentally ill pilgrims. Local families took them in, and they worked alongside everyone else. That system is still running today, 700 years later. A small town figured out community-based care half a millennium before modern psychiatry even existed. Then, the 16th and 17th centuries rolled around, and the era of the massive institution began. Asylums like London's Bethlem Royal Hospital, nicknamed Bedlam, became places of chaotic confinement. It gets darker. In the 17th century, Bethlem charged the public admission just to stare at the patients for entertainment. Treating human suffering as a weekend spectacle shows just how dehumanized the mentally ill had become. If you want to keep exploring the hidden and strange corners of human history with me, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video. The Enlightenment eventually brought a shift in the 18th century. Reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England argued that patients deserved human dignity. Tuke's York Retreat operated on the radical premise of kindness, fresh air, and social support, and, miraculously, patients actually improved. But by the 19th century, well-intentioned asylums became catastrophically overcrowded, turning into traumatic, under-resourced warehouses. At the exact same time, brilliant minds like Emil Kraepelin were laying the foundations of modern scientific psychiatry. The knowledge was advancing faster than society could organize its humanity. Looking back at this massive historical arc, a profound pattern emerges. The most humane treatments didn't always come from the most technologically advanced societies. They often came from communities that simply applied basic empathy. Ancient Babylon got the science wrong, but tried to help. The Enlightenment brought dignity, but built overcrowded institutions. Today, we have scientific frameworks, therapies, and legal protections that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Yet the gap between what we know and how we actually apply it remains. The real question isn't just what we understand about